This lecture is an examination of history of medieval Russia. So far, we have looked at early Russia and settlement of this northern area by early Slavic tribes, and we also identified two key areas where settlement seems to expand from. That would be Kiev and also Novgorod. We also talked about the emergence of the Orthodox Church and Vladimir accepting Orthodox Christianity and therefore imposing it upon his citizens and subjects. We also examined the threat that Kievan and Novgorod, Russia, have from the east in the rise of Genghis Khan and the Mongols and the continual invasions and dominations from the east by their Mongol invaders. This creates what is called the Tartar yoke, Mongols being another name for the Tartars. The Tartar yoke upon Russia was a system of domination, but also taxation, in which Slavs were forced to pay their taxes to the Khan, the leader of the Tartars, and if they revolted, they would experience great violence and suppression by the Mongol forces. We can now see by the 13th century the emergence of another important population center, that being Moscow, whereas Kiev and Novgorod struggle to maintain some degree of independence or at least avoid destruction by the Mongols. Moscow becomes another important settlement, and particularly their citizens in their resistance against the Tartars. The city of Moscow was first founded somewhere around the 1100s AD. Like a lot of major cities, it was located at the nexus of three major rivers, that being the Volga, the Dnieper, and the Don. It was at a strategic location, therefore, to challenge the Tartar yoke and Mongol domination. Very important early leader in the history of Moscow was Ivan I. He earns the gratitude of the Mongols for his willingness to suppress Russian revolts against Mongol domination. These were revolts that were going to fail anyway, and so Ivan avoids the destruction of Moscow by, in a sense, partnering with the Mongols to avoid rebellions. The Mongols are, in fact, so thankful for Ivan for doing this that they allow Ivan to become the chief tribute collector, chief tax collector, that would continue to support the Tartar yoke. They designate him the Grand Prince of Moscow, and he becomes one of the most powerful of the Russian princes. And he earns this nickname of Ivan Moneybag for his willingness to collect taxes and then provide them to the Mongols and therefore avoid the destruction of Moscow. So he's a very key leader in the emergence of Moscow as a very pivotal location in medieval Russia. The other important accomplishment that Ivan achieves for the ascendancy of the city of Moscow is that he convinces the patriarch, the leader of the Russian Orthodox Church, to leave Kiev as the center of religion and move to Moscow. This also accentuates Moscow as a center of power in medieval Russia. Another significant Grand Prince of Moscow in the medieval period was Dmitry Donskoy. Dmitry Donskoy was the first Muscovite prince to openly challenge the Mongols, and then as a result earns everlasting fame in Russian history as one of these Russian princes who was finally willing to stand up with success against the Mongols. He achieves his success at the Battle of Kulikovo. The Battle of Kulikovo was fought between the armies of the Golden Horde and various Russian princes, primarily under the command of Prince Dmitry of Moscow. The battle took place on September 8, 1380, at Kulikovo Field near the Don River, and was a significant strategic victory, the first major victory of a Russian prince and his forces against the Mongols. Gradually, we're going to see the decline of Mongol influence in the western part of Russia. This has a lot to do with internal problems and divisions and weaknesses within the Mongol Empire, particularly after the death of Genghis Khan. But Dmitri's victory at the Battle of Kulikovo certainly was a turning point in starting to push back against the Tartar yoke and allow for the independence of the Russians to the west. What's interesting about the Battle of Kulikovo, it has a lot of similarities to the famous battle between the Israelites and the Philistines involving David and Goliath. So the Battle of Kulikovo begins with a Russian champion fighting a Mongol champion in single combat. So you remember from the story in the Bible of David and Goliath that these two armies face each other in the Israelites and the Philistines, and the Philistines would send out Goliath just to represent their armies, and if anyone could beat Goliath, then all the Philistines would be subject to the Israelites, and the alternative was the case as well for the Israelites. Of course, the Philistines felt great confidence in Goliath representing their army, and of course, David unexpectedly defeats Goliath. The same thing happens before the Battle of Kulikovo, in which this Russian champion meets the Mongol champion. Unfortunately, both died in this single engagement of conflict, and therefore the two armies do face each other with a significant victory led by Prince Dmitry and the Russian forces driving back for the first time the Mongol forces. Another significant prince in the early history of Moscow was Ivan III, nicknamed Ivan the Great, because whereas Prince Dmitry was the first to secure and achieve a significant military victory against the Mongols, Ivan III openly challenges Mongol rule and asserts the dominance of Muscovite Russia. And it is he who's credited with really making Russia an empire with Moscow as its center and as its capital. Ivan was the first to take the name of Tsar. Tsar is derived from the old imperial Roman title of Caesar. And so thus by taking that title, Ivan III was connecting himself to classical Rome, and he proclaimed Russia to be a third Rome. Of course, the Western Roman Empire falls in 476 AD, and the Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantium, falls in 1453, and right before his reign as Grand Prince. And therefore, he sees this new Russian Empire that he is creating, with dominions to the north and incorporating Kiev and Novgorod, and lands even to the far northeast, as a third Rome that will replace the older halves of the Roman Empire and start to push back on Tartar influence. So the long-term legacy of Ivan III's reign is his willingness to openly challenge the Mongols, and this clearly signals the decline of the Mongol Empire, which will be significantly reduced, and it marks the rise of the Russian Empire. Ivan III was not opposed to using great violence in suppressing rebels against his authority. We see this in his destruction of the Novgorod assembly, in which hundreds and thousands of citizens of Novgorod who were reluctant to submit to his authority from Moscow are violently suppressed and murdered in the town green. Therefore, Ivan III really makes Moscow as the center of this new Russian Empire. A prominent symbol of this new power of Moscow is the construction of its Kremlin. You'll remember that a Kremlin is a fortress, essentially an early or medieval bricked or walled fortress for defense, and then dwellings and palaces and churches can be constructed inside. So the largest and most significant Kremlin in Russia is the Moscow Kremlin. It has been added upon for many years. Originally, it simply had a military or strategic purpose, but gradually it expanded with various architectural features, including the influence of Italian architects, and it is still the center of power of the Russian Federation today. We can see that originally it was right on the banks of the Muscovy River, gradually an embankment when threat from enemies is not so significant in the early modern period. We can see that this highway is constructed right along the banks of the Muscovy River right next to the Moscow Kremlin. The Kremlin becomes a nickname for the Russian government. So if we want to speak of the Russian leadership, even today, we might talk about what is happening with and inside the Kremlin. The Grand Kremlin Palace, built in 1838, is still the official residence of the President of Russia today. This is where he lives and resides, so we can think of this as the White House in Russia today. It is also home to the State Kremlin Palace. And also you have these very ornate, very magisterial towers at several points along the walls of the Kremlin, including the Spasskaya Tower. Also, more famous probably is the Trutskaya Tower, 260 feet high, built in 1495. And inside of the Kremlin walls, we also see significant churches, including Ivan the Great Bell Tower, as well as the Dormition Cathedral. The Kremlin also surrounds one of the most famous squares in the world, and that is Red Square. Red is a very traditional color in Russia. For a long time, it is simply considered a very beautiful color. It's a regal, royal color, and that is how it's viewed for much of Russian history. It also has much more negative connotations as being the color of blood, and the Bolsheviks and the communists will adopt it as the color of blood and revolution with the Russian Revolution in 1917. And so red remains a very significant color in the history of Russia. So here we see Red Square in the middle of the Moscow Kremlin. Very large square surrounded by very key significant government buildings and is also historical buildings. Key features of Red Square include the largest cannon in the world that has never been fired. This was the Tsar cannon commissioned in 1586, but too large to fire some of these cannonballs that was to be loaded with, judged to be too dangerous. Red Square also contains the largest bell in the world, which was quickly cooled, far too quickly cooled after it was casted, and therefore it cracked and this large piece fell out of the bell. So therefore, Russia has not only the largest country in the world, size and expanse and bragging rights for having the largest item in the world is very important in Russian history. And we see that they have the largest art museum in the world, of course, the largest country in the world, and they also have the largest cannon in the world that's never been fired and the largest bell in the world that has never been rung. Also, a prominent building along the sides of Red Square is GUM. GUM is, many people would judge this to be the first shopping mall in world history. It has roots that go all the way back to Catherine the Great in the late 18th century. The original building is burned with Napoleon's invasion in 1812, and then gradually is rebuilt and expanded. It has played important important roles for the state of Russia, state ceremonies, and so forth. But certainly we can see in 1893 that its double-decker level of stores here was quite large for the late 19th century. This is a view of the interior of GUM still today. Also along the outskirts of Red Square is the State Historical Museum. The State Historical Museum includes well over 1 million coins and many artifacts from early Russian history, the early modern period, and also modern Russian history as well. Red Square is, of course, a gorgeous sight to be seen. It is a very large cobblestone square. Also included in Red Square is very famous St. Basil's Cathedral, the famous towers, and also Lenin's tomb, which houses the still preserved and publicly displayed body of Vladimir Lenin, who's the prime leader of the Russian Revolution. Very significant leader for medieval Russia is Ivan IV, better known as Ivan the Terrible. Now, we shouldn't react too strongly to that title of the Terrible. Many people quickly assume, simply because he was called terrible, that is a strictly negative term. Indeed, Ivan IV was a very violent ruler of Russia, but many leaders of the Roerich dynasty and the Romanov dynasty to follow were very violent in their suppression of their populations and very suspicious of those that threatened rebellion. By the term the terrible, we actually mean, in how the Russian people mean it, means more awesome or fearsome or intimidating. It can have a negative connotation to it, but it's much more a title of esteem and reverence and awe than it is simply ascribing to him tyranny and oppression of the people. Ivan the Terrible, Ivan IV, was definitely the first leader of Russia that regularly was designated by this title of Tsar. He wasn't the first to take it, of course, but he was regularly referred to as the Tsar of Russia, and he rules from 1547 to 1584. Here is his throne, which was made of ivory, metal, and also of wood. Some of the key events that we can talk about and remember about Ivan's reign is that he is indeed the first to establish the Tsardom of Russia, with Moscow being the center of his power and its principal state. The capital of Russia throughout its history is going to move several times. We've already talked about the significance of early Kiev in Russia. Then we talked about Novgorod as being a very important center, capital, if you will. Now we're talking about the Grand Duchy of Moscow as being the center of attention. Later in our next lecture, we'll see how Peter the Great creates a new city and moves the capital from Moscow to St. Petersburg, which will be the capital of Russia for several centuries until it is moved back to Moscow by the communists in 1918 after the Russian Revolution. Ivan IV also creates the Streltsy, which was a large standing army, thus reinforcing his power and expanding the empire, and also continuing to beat back the Mongol threat and Tartar domination from the east. He is also instrumental in creating the first printing press, called the Moscow Print Yard, and he also commissioned the building of St. Basil's Cathedral in Red Square. He orders the sack of Novgorod in 1570, and as a measure of his violence, he is responsible for the murder of his son and daughter-in-law as well. So let's talk about these items individually here. Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible, commissions probably the most famous and certainly the most beautiful church in all of Russia, and this is St. Basil's Cathedral. It was built from 1555 to 1561. The reason he commissioned the construction of this church was it commemorated his victories over Kazan, which was an important region area to the east, and also Astrakhan. And Ivan IV really achieves fame for his defeat of the Mongols to the east, and really his military victories indicate the end of the threat of the Mongols from the east. So in response to that, in praise to God, he commissions the construction of this church, which is a very colorful church. Russian people themselves have often associated it with a bowl of fruit. Of course, it has this very famous onion domes, a very distinct feature of Russian church architecture. There is a myth that is associated with this church that Ivan commissioned the very best architects all around Russia to build him the most beautiful church. And once the church was completed, that he had all the eyes of the architects removed so that they would never be able to conceive of a more beautiful church and be successful in building another church. However, that is a myth. That is part of a lot of the negative propaganda that is associated with Ivan the Terrible, particularly from the West and from his critics and enemies. That's simply not true. Not that Ivan, again, was necessarily a charitable czar. He definitely did have a very violent and destructive strange to him. In fact, we can see that stone circle at the base of the church there, right in front of the church. One of the features and roles that that stone circle played was that Ivan was known for bringing his enemies there to be publicly beheaded in Red Square. It is also true that he used the streltsy, or the standing army, to go and hunt down some of his enemies, some who are already dead and buried in areas of Russia, and have them dragged to Moscow, where they were beheaded on that site as well. So it's essentially an execution chamber right in front of this beautiful church that he has constructed in Red Square. One of the most important contributions that Ivan the Terrible creates is the commissioning of the Muscovy Company. The Muscovy Company was an English trading company. So it's an English company, but it has Ivan's authority connected to it, in that he endorses it. This is the first major trading company, first major joint stock company that is created in England and established a network of trade between Elizabethan England and Muscovite Russia. The joint stock company, of course, is a very important development in Elizabethan England. It will be a very important type of company that will flourish and will lead to the colonization of North America, particularly with the creation of the London Company, which will settle Jamestown and also Plymouth. The Muscovy Company had a monopoly of trade between England and Muscovy until 1698. It will remain as an important trading company all the way until the Russian Revolution of 1917. Since that year, the company has now operated as a charity, still working within Russia. But nevertheless, the Muscovy Company establishes trade between England and Russia, and therefore Russia starts to become aware of some of the developments and technological developments in England that they did not have in their own country, and it establishes an important point of contact between Russia and the West. Ivan is known as the Terrible for being a very awe-inspiring leader, but he definitely did indeed have a violent strain to him. Ivan, for much of his childhood, was overseen and raised by the boyars. Remember that the boyars are the Russian nobles. Needless to say, the boyars didn't really have a vested interest in keeping him safe. They were known for teasing him as a child, often make him contend and compete for his own food. They would deny him bread to make sure that they reinforced his sense of dependency upon him. So you imagine a child who's being denied food has to often hide from being harassed and hazed by the nobles, developed quite a bit of bitter resentment. And so later on, when he indeed does become czar, he certainly has a violent streak in him, often directed against the boyars who he frequently suspected were plotting against him. A lot of that stemmed back to his childhood. Ivan the Terrible marries several times. He has 4 legitimate wives. 3 of them are poisoned, presumably by his enemies, possibly and probably the boyars, in an effort to promote their own daughters to become the Tsar's bride. So a way of promoting your own family fortunes, if you're a Russian noble, was to get one of your daughters or sisters to marry the Tsar, and therefore you would have influence at court. So needless to say, with all this death surrounding his closest companions and his own wives, Ivan points the finger at the boyars. They often deny this, but indeed, we do find out later that a lot of his wives indeed were poisoned by the boyars. He probably had additional wives to the 4 legitimate wives that we're aware of, and in addition, concubines. It seems that the wife that Ivan loved and treasured the most was his first wife, Anastasia. Anastasia was seen to be very much in love with Ivan as well. They were just very young when they got married, and an agent for the Muscovy Company wrote in his memoirs about Anastasia and Ivan IV that he, being young and riotous, she ruled him with admirable affability, and wisdom. So, in other words, his first wife, his young first wife, has a very temporizing, calming influence on Ivan. But in the summer of 1560, Anastasia fell ill to illness and she dies in August. In consequence to these events, it seems that Ivan suffered some types of a nervous breakdown, some type of emotional collapse, suspecting that his wife had been a victim of poisoning, which indeed later is proved that indeed she did. There was no evidence of this crimes at the time, but nevertheless, Ivan used this occasion in the death of his first beloved wife to have a number of the boyars tortured. It turns out that modern examination of the bone remains of Anastasia in the late 20th century by archaeologists and forensics experts has indeed provided evidence to sustain her husband's claim that indeed high levels of mercury were found in Anastasia's hair, which is usually a symptom of poisoning. And it probably indeed indicates that indeed Anastasia was poisoned. So the Tsar, suspecting this, enacts a new series of reprisals against the boyars, having many of them tortured and executed in response as vengeance for his first wife's death. Particularly in response to her death, Ivan develops a corps of fearsome black-clad men who would terrorize the population, particularly the boyars, on behalf of the Tsar, known as the oprichniki. Now, imagine 3 of Ivan's legitimate first 4 wives are all probably poisoned to death. So if Ivan didn't already have a lot of suspicions and lingering anger from his childhood directed against the boyars, he certainly does now in response to the death of his wives. Another one of his famous wives was Vasilisa Melentieva, who was Ivan's 6th wife, possibly concubine. We're not sure if they are exactly officially married or not. And although the Tsar considered her beautiful and sweet-natured and hopefully a replacement for his first beloved wife of Anastasia, a few months after their marriage, Ivan discovers that she was having an affair with a prince named Devletov. As a result, Ivan forced Vasilisa to watch her lover to be impaled, stabbed through, stuck on a pike or a spear, and then as further punishment also had Vasilisa confined to a cloister for the rest of her life. With so much death and assassination and suspicion surrounding him, not only does Ivan create a standing army, but he also creates the very feared oprichniki. The oprichniki we can think perhaps as a secret police that worked on behalf of the Tsar, not only as bodyguards, but also to hunt down, terrorize, kidnap, torture, and kill his enemies. The creation of the oprichniki, or the secret police, is very significant in Russian history because there is a long history of secret police in Russian history. So we can here think of the oprichniki created by Ivan the Terrible. Later on, with the reign of the Tsars, we will see the Cheka. The Cheka was a secret police that operated on behalf of the Tsars. And with the ascension of the communists after the Russian Revolution, particularly during the reign of Joseph Stalin, we see the emergence of the KGB, which was a secret police that tortured and executed many suspects, those who were suspected of plotting against the communist state. Even with the dissolution of the Soviet Union in 1991, in some ways the Russian Federation, the modern Russian state, still has a secret police organ of government known as the Federal Security Service. The current president of Russia, Vladimir Putin, was previously a KGB operative, and he was the director of the Federal Security Service before he becomes president of Russia. So the oprichniki, created by Ivan the Terrible, represents the establishment of a new secret police that is going to have far-ranging ramifications for Russian state control over its population, really for centuries to come. The oprichniki, without question, one of the most feared organizations in Russia. They were sometimes known as the dog soldiers. They would ride their horses throughout regions of Russia to impose the will of the Tsar and to arrest people who were viewed to be plotting against him. These soldiers on horseback were dressed in black. Sometimes they actually dressed their horses in black. And they would cut off either a dog's head or a wolf's head and attach it to their saddles. And so these dogs' heads, which were designed supposedly to sniff out the Tsar's enemies, were often accompanied with a broom on the horses of the oprichniki. And so the broom was a symbol to sweep away the enemies of the Tsar, and the dog's head was designed to sniff out the Tsar's enemies. Now, of course, you can't keep a dead dog's head attached to your saddle forever. Needless to say, it'll start to rot and smell pretty bad. And so as a result, there is quite a rash of killing dogs throughout Russia during the reign of Ivan, so that these oprichniki soldiers would have a fresh dog's head throughout the year. The dog's head would freeze during the winter, but then, of course, smell quite a bit and start to rot in the summer. You'd have to replace it with a new dog's head. The legend is that the Tsar himself had a dog's head attached to his own horse, which was made out of iron and had iron jaws that would snap open and shut as the horse galloped along. So, through the powerful uses of symbolism and their feared practices of arresting, torturing, and executing people on behalf of the Tsar, the oprichniki becomes a very feared element of Ivan's reign. And so here is a depiction of people fleeing at the arrival of the oprichniki during another massacre of Novgorod, as depicted in 1911. City of Novgorod is the center of a lot of violent suppression by princes of Moscow. We've already seen this during the reign of Ivan III, and now we see it again during the reign of Ivan IV, Ivan the Terrible. The city of Novgorod was falsely rumored to be conspiring against Ivan and forming an alliance with his enemies, particularly foreign enemies. Perhaps one of the reasons that Ivan was particularly suspicious and jealous of the city of Novgorod, that region northwest of Russia is famous for its birch trees and particularly its birch bark. And the birch bark from the area could be used as a form of paper. And archaeologists have discovered in some of their excavations surrounding the city of Novgorod that the residents had conducted a rather thriving trade, particularly with Europe and Scandinavian countries. And we see documents of trade and transactions and even bookkeeping being kept on some of this birch bark paper that has been discovered. And so it's quite possible that the Grand Prince of Moscow, Ivan the Terrible, was quite jealous of this trade and very suspicious of this trade that the residents of Novgorod and the business people of Novgorod were conducting with the West, and particularly with some of Ivan's enemies, and therefore ordered the sack or destruction of Novgorod. The Massacre of Novgorod consisted of men, women, and children that were tied to sleighs and then run into the freezing waters of the local Volkhov River. These executions are often ordered by Ivan himself on the basis of unproved accusations of treason. He also had many of its inhabitants tortured and killed. Even the archbishop was hunted to death. And almost every day, 500 to 600 people were either killed or drowned in this famous sack of Novgorod. We're not sure the exact numbers, but modern researchers speculate that perhaps the executions of Novgorod range all the way to somewhere to 2,000 and 3,000 individuals. Many of the survivors of the sack of Novgorod were deported elsewhere in Russia. As a final piece of evidence of the violence of Ivan the Terrible, we of course need to look again at his relationship with his family and particularly his children. Remember that 3 of his first 4 legitimate wives seem to have been poisoned to death. He himself was extensively teased and hazed as a child, and so he enacts brutal repression of the boyars throughout his term. And his violence which definitely seems to have picked up in frequency and intensity after the death of his first beloved wife, even carries over to his family. Apparently, there was a very violent argument between Ivan and his daughter-in-law. His daughter-in-law was wearing immodest clothing, which was apparently probably Western clothing. And so in 1581, in a violent rage, he actually beats his pregnant daughter-in-law to death for what he viewed as an embarrassment. And so his son, husband of his now dead daughter-in-law, seeks to respond to his father with violence and came at him. But his second son, named Ivan, upon learning of this, after engaging in a heated argument, Ivan strikes his son with a pointed staff. And by hitting him in the head with this staff, it leads to him being fatally wounded. And so the Tsar Ivan IV is responsible for the death of his daughter-in-law as also his son. Towards the end of his reign, Ivan the Terrible becomes a very reclusive individual with still violent mood streaks that seem to characterize his reign. So even though the term the Terrible indicates awe or great respect or awesomeness in Russian terminology, certainly Ivan IV's reign does earn this moniker appropriately of Ivan the Terrible all the way to his death in 1584. After his death and a series of weak rulers, Russia is really thrown into a time of turmoil. There seems to be these recurring patterns in Russian history, and one of them is what we can call a time of troubles. By a time of troubles, we mean a time period in which there is no strong leadership, there is no strong czar, there is no strong ruler. And so as a result, Russia descends into chaos and often civil war, usually occurring between various boyar factions. The Russian nobles, without someone to keep them in check, tend to fight against each other. And so we have one of the most notable time of troubles in Russian history from 1598 to 1613. It is definitely a trend in Russian history that the Russian people prefer one strong leader. They do not like times of political fragmentation in which various interest groups are competing against each other. So what we see throughout Russian history, to some degree, are various times of trouble followed by a strong leader. We certainly see a period of instability until the emergence of Moscow, and particularly Ivan the Terrible. After his death, we see a time of troubles in which there is no central czar who is a strong figure, until we see the emergence of the Romanov dynasty, and then some more weakness until we see the emergence of Peter the Great. And then again, we see a period of weakness or a time of troubles until the emergence of Catherine the Great at the end of the 18th century. And then we see again a period of weakness right before the Russian Revolution and the emergence of the very strong Bolshevik Party in Lenin and in Stalin and subsequent Soviet leaders. And then we also see a period of weakness in the 1990s under the presidency of Boris Yeltsin, which is going to lead to the very strong presidency of Vladimir Putin. So the first and greatest time of troubles we can identify from 1598 to 1613. This is a period in medieval Russia in which there are boyar revolts, competing factions, civil war. Each boyar has their own private army that is competing with each other and bringing violence all across Russia. In addition, the emerging kingdom of Poland and Lithuania to the west takes advantage of Russia's weakness to invade during these years, and there's also widespread famine. So this is not a time of stability and prosperity for Russia. Finally, in desperation, a small group of representatives come together in Russia, known as the Zemsky Sobor. The Zemsky Sobor was essentially a parliament that represented the landed class, the nobles, and also some of the clergy. And out of great frustration, they agreed to stop fighting each other and the need for a strong central leader. And therefore, this Zemsky Sobor, this convention, elects Michael I, Michael Romanov, the first of the long-standing and last dynasty of Russia, the Romanovs. Very important dynasty that for the rest of our study of Russian history will be focused on the Romanov dynasty. He is declared to be Tsar. He was a distant relative of one of the last members of the Rurik preceding dynasty. But the most significant part of Michael's reign is that he indeed establishes the Romanov dynasty at the tender age of 16 years old. He is given the crown. He will reign from 1613 to 1645. But the most significant part about the installation of Michael as Tsar is that it begins this very famous dynasty which will predominate Russian politics all the way up to the pivotal year of 1917 in the Russian Revolution. A dynasty that is going to last over 300 years. And just as it celebrates its 300th anniversary, just a few years later, it, of course, will come to an end with the Russian Revolution in that pivotal year.